As well as the more robust second-gen primates, Kecha Wacha and Bishaten represent a separate lineage that have not been so quick to abandon their arboreal origins. Despite being smaller and solitary, they still manage to eke out a living in the land of the wyverns in a different fashion to their burlier relatives. So with no mention of much sexual dimorphism in Kecha Wacha, and very limited sexual dimorphism in Bishaten, with females appearing similar to the males except for the horns and the white ruff of fur around the neck, it could be worth exploring this big difference from the other primates in the series, and the increased arboreality, or rather arboreality that never got decreased, may well be a major factor of several contributing here. Arboreality does place a hard cap on body size even in the Monster Hunter universe, and whilst the definition can be stretched with such giant trees like those in the ancient forest, many larger monsters would be too heavy and not dexterous enough to move among the branches. The slant into strong arboreal behaviour also negates another need for large body size in males, which is predator defence. If you can already flee into dense canopies or to narrow branches, where heavier, less mobile attackers can't get you, then you don't need to fight when you can flee. Promiscuity could be another factor too. Bishaten females and young apparently live together, with males only coming to find them in the mating season. If this is the case and the female groups overlap with several male territories who have minimal interaction, then a male Bishaten doesn't need to defend his troop from other males as Kongolala or Blangonga do, because they're not his females in the same way. The carved description for the neck ruff does seem to suggest Bishaten males do fight, and said ruff is for protection from bites, but this can be over simple territory over the specific females themselves. Little is known in comparison of Kecha and their mating system and sociality, but if they're solitary and can be considered analogous to basal nocturnal primates in that regard, then similarly, competition for females can be expected to be minimal without a group of females to protect as well, thus leading to Kecha being comparatively small and slight without a need to be bigger. Certain significant features of their morphology that do exist as sexual dimorphism could be an attempt to still imitate larger body sizes without actually having the mass to back that up. As said, Bishaten's ruff is one such example of pre-existing sexual dimorphism, and Kecha's ears could be another, with the brighter and more colourful spots apparently being more attractive to females. As some baboons do, both of these could be to make the males look larger and more intimidating without actually spending the biomass to be that. For Bishaten in particular, food could also provide a limit too. As a frugivore, it has both a low-protein diet and a highly seasonal one, and thus it may be limited as to how large it can grow on its diet before it'd risk exhausting its reserves. This also presents it with the problem of the seasonality of its food, in that many frugivores have either two options of migrating to areas where there's still plenty of food, or having what are known as fallback foods, such as leaves, bark, or other animals. Bishaten apparently has the latter of the latter, and will eat smaller animals in tough times when fruit aren't in season. Whilst the giant persimmons known as jumbo fruit seem to be Bishaten's favourite, the variety of other fruits picked as well, and other unseen species it presumably consumes, may mean there's always at least some crop of fruit that it can partially utilise, and some fruits, like species of figs in our world, grow all year round. Bishaten's pouch is seemingly something of a response to this too, being used to store fruit until it's sufficiently ripened or has begun to decay, to become poisonous for use in self-defense, although in females one may assume it's used to carry young for a certain time, and this was the original cause of the pouch developing. Some habitual frugivores, like black-backed jackals, show behaviour that may suggest they bookmark certain fruits that will soon ripen, especially those that don't show visual signs of ripening, to either notify themselves for later or to try and disguise them from other jackals. Bishaten's behaviours suggest that it clearly has the cognition to understand that time increases fruit edibility, and keeping fruit in the pouch to ripen may be one factor to help it around the seasonal nature of its food. Another fallback food for base Bishaten may well be nuts and seeds, as evidenced by the existence of blood orange Bishaten, whose preferred food is seemingly pine cones. Blood orange Bishaten presumably gain most of their nutrients from the pine seeds visible within the cones, and when not throwing them at opposition, pick the large seeds out. The speciation between the two is presumably brought on by the different latitudes of their habitats, with orangutans adapting to the far cooler climate by incorporating less fruit in their diets, and the fire abilities seemingly stemming from diet too. Diet shifts from more typical food like fruits to lesser ones like leaves are seen in primates that get to higher latitudes such as gibbons, who shift to leaves in areas of southern China they're still found in. Orangutans may still eat fruit wherever possible, or whenever possible such as the warm summer months, but combine it with nuts as a primary food, and may have other more or less nutritious fallback foods like leaves or smaller animals come winter. With their cognizance over their seasonal food source, it may even be possible orangutans cache pine nuts as squirrels do, or rob the caches of other animals as bears often do, for the same pine nuts that can form a major part of their own diet. Predictably, this harsher environment with fewer resources may also result in orangutans having larger territories, and living at lower densities than their tropical and subtropical cousins. Kecha Wacha, on the other hand, is an insectivore, doing most of its foraging in the trees for the assorted giant invertebrates of the monster hunter world. And as such, it's clearly well equipped to do so. With giant ears, it can presumably listen for the movement of invertebrates in the trees, and potentially the ground too, as many insectivores do. Also present are the huge talons on the hand, which may be reminiscent of the ring finger of the eye and fulfill a similar role in a behaviour known as percussive foraging, or tap foraging. This is where an animal taps the surfaces of trees and bark to listen for cavities within that may hold invertebrate prey. The comparative mass and strength of Kecha Wacha presumably end similarities there, and it seems to lack a ball and socket joint in its fingers, which the eye has, to wrinkle around inside the bark burrows, in favour of the serrated talons which are likely able to cut through the tree bark as Kecha Wacha digs its prey out. The prey it takes are also considerably larger relative to its own body mass, with invertebrates like Altaroth and Hornator being consumed, when compared to the cerambyid beetle larvae most sought after by the eye, that require a more delicate touch. At least some prey, like Altaroth, seem social as well, and so a Kecha Wacha that finds an occupied tree nest of them can presumably expect to eat to satiation in a single foraging bout. It also seems to be a versatile insectivore, and the watery mucus expelled from the nose is apparently for prey too, ostensibly for large volant prey like vespoids to gum up the wings and prevent them from flying for an easy meal. For ash Kecha Wacha, its seemingly lesser dependence on trees and more time spent on the steppes suggest a more terrestrial lifestyle. The large and multiple claws on each hand may be instead used for partial digging in ash, and while still an insectivore that can and occasionally does forage from trees, it may obtain more of its food from ground-dwelling invertebrates. If the steppes and their hill forest islands have sufficient conchu numbers to support Yan Kutku, then this may presumably be a key part of ash's diet as well. Conchu will hide a foot or so beneath the topsoil, but don't need major equipment to be dug out, and so the already sufficiently robust claws may be strong enough to allow them access to this abundant food resource. The use of fire is harder to determine the cause for, but one suggestion could be to repel the raptorial bird wyverns present on the steppe. Jaggi seem to fear fire, and Great Jaggi's weakness to fire could be interpreted into a similar phobia. Both base and ash Kecha Wacha show adaptations that could be interpreted as them being nocturnal, even if this is hard to call in monsters without a meaningful day and night cycle. But it would make sense. In the daytime, the steppes would be patrolled by more diurnal flying wyverns like tigrex and both sexes of wrath, either of which would easily be able to chase down either type of Kecha Wacha in an open field. So rather, the primates come out at night, and so ash, as the type that uses the open areas far more often, is darker furred for camouflage at night, but also has the fire mucus to deal with the far more manageable predators of the bird wyverns. A Great Jaggi and its pack would likely be able to handle any Kecha Wacha, but can be kept at bay or repelled with fire, at least until it can glide to safety. In both ash and orangutan, The subspecies seem to have evolved in response to the base species living on the fringes of suboptimal habitats for them. Despite Bishaten being first encountered and most associated with the shrine ruins, and Kecha Wacha with the ancestral steppe, neither of these habitats seem as ideal for them as the flooded or primal forest respectively, both containing more cover, more and larger trees for them to move in safety, presumably more of their chief food sources and with less seasonal impacts, and fewer predators as well. So both species may reach their highest densities and live their best lives in these more tropical environments, over the much cooler and/or drier habitats they're first encountered in. The mountainous bamboo forests around Komora may be the limits of Bishaten's range before Orangutan takes over, and may also be the northern limit for other typically tropical or subtropical monsters like Astalos, Nagakuga and Puki as well. The steppes overall seem to just be comparatively poor habitat for a large population of Kecha Wacha, and whilst they persist in the forests and wooded mountains, these populations presumably live in scattered subpopulations in the assorted outcroppings and lowland forests. In periods of low food abundance or dispersal, they ostensibly have to undergo risky journeys across the open steppes, and likely do so at night to avoid potential predation as said. Kecha Wacha likely undertake at least part of some of these journeys on the wing, or rather the patagium, to minimise contact with the predator-controlled ground. Both types have considerable gliding ability, and likely a number of specialised muscles to help control the skin and limbs too. For longer journeys, Kecha Wacha presumably fly at considerable speed, for the maximum available glide ratio due to their very heavy wing loading. Kecha Wacha may well leap from the highest point available to try and catch gusts of wind too for the longest journeys they can manage, and whenever the hills and ruins allow, try to make a second leap after landing too. The upside of their heavy wing loading is that it likely does facilitate the speeds they need by minimising billowing too, which is also detrimental for efficient gliding. This may stem from two evolutionary prompts even before Kecha Wacha can consider it to shorten risky long-distance travel. One, the classic desire to limit energy usage, especially for animals like Kecha Wacha and Bishaten, that typically live in trees but often move up and down them, as unsurprisingly gliding is indeed cheaper than walking, and more efficient than descending a tree normally too. As well as this, lessening landing impacts in arboreal movement may also be another factor. In flying squirrels, one theory is believed to be to allow for the deceleration in high-speed arboreal movement, and thus reduce the stress on limbs in acrobatic jumps. Both Kecha Wacha and Bishaten have a lot of leaping acrobatic moves as well as being tree dwellers, and fast as they may seem even when not seemingly opening them, they may still be useful to reduce impact stresses on the limbs as well. Gliding in Kecha Wacha, and to the more limited extent Bishaten manages it too, may stem from their typically long primate life histories, as a pretty successful way to save energy on locomotion and reduce risk of predation in travelling. It presumably contributes to low rates of predation that in turn could potentially factor into slowed life history, with things like slower and later maturation, late senescence and lower fecundity. This is seen in flying squirrels too, who are some of the most long-lived of rodents with their adaptations for a longer, slower life. Kecha Wacha and Bishaten are presumably some of the longest-lived monsters for their weight class. When compared to raptorial bird wyverns with their ostensibly high turnover rates due to predation, sympatric beaked bird wyverns like Yankutku, which a fast life history could well be suggested from due to their fast growth and high fecundity, and the frequency of which male celtus get eaten by their mates in what is presumably their first rodeo on sexual maturation. Other primates are typically larger and social, and may not need as much specialization that results in things like gliding due to the increased vigilance of the group and the protection of a large male or males. But as well as gliding, both Kecha Wacha and Bishaten spend a lot of their time in the trees too, and both show adaptations for climbing. Interestingly, Kecha Wacha's claws aren't really like the hands of a monkey, but much more like those of a sloth, and this is presumably due to the fact it spends a lot of its time hanging too. It both feeds and sleeps whilst hanging from the canopy, and so the claws are likely due to the fact that this is simply a much cheaper way to do it than hanging on with just your hands. It also shows a difference between the two in that whilst they're both arboreal animals, Kecha Wacha is a tree-dwelling animal with a preference for the canopies, whereas Bishaten is a tree-dwelling animal with a preference for the ground. Kecha Wacha often utilises vines and other similar plants in its climbing, and this is similarly seen in sloths, who are often in canopy vines when climbing too. It's believed there may be a link and that such claws may be ideal for vines. Kecha Wacha will also brachiate, which is the technical term for Tarzan swinging, but it does so relatively slowly. Gibbons, in comparison, will brachiate in two ways: continuous contact and ricochettal, the former being like walking and the latter being like running. It would seem that even as one of the more gracile monster hunter primates, Kecha Wacha may be too heavy to allow for ricochettal brachiating, and rather uses continuous contact to move through a canopy, which is still seen in larger and more robust primates like gorillas or Congalala too, or by using single swings to launch itself into a glide. With its gliding, it also has relatively little need for swift ricochettal brachiating, and presumably uses the gliding to escape threats. Bishaten, on the other hand, has its most noticeable feature as its other hand, the one on its tail specifically. Whilst Bishaten can use this in a similar fashion to Kecha and hang from it, the chief use seems to be either for support or carrying fruit. For the former reason, this may seem like a lot for such a specialised organ, but it's probably much more reflective of how much Bishaten uses the ground now compared to its evolutionary past. In a similar vein, large red kangaroos also now use their tails as extra limbs in essence, when originally they were for balance and grasping trees in their arboreal past. It's likely the same for Bishaten, although Bishaten still uses the tree sometimes too, so the initial use in climbing will still be at least partially present, and can sometimes be seen in the fight too. Bishaten being able to improve its height and use all four limbs may help when fighting others of its own kind, or trying to just bluff away predatory monsters. And above all else, it's also just useful to have an extra hand too. Picking and carrying extra fruit, carrying young, manipulating items, freeing the forelimbs, whatever a tail hand costs, is likely paid for by its uses several times over. Finally, the ears of Kecha Wacha appear to have some use in dematic displays, which is to say they could be used to scare off predators. But it's worth noting these can have limited success even against sight-based predators, and the aggressive predators of the steppe and forest are not likely to be cowed by them. Rather, cuttlefish use them to scare off smaller annoyances, with reasons suggested including that they may draw in predators, or they may compete with them for food. Some social small predators may also still try and give it a shot as well. So whilst canonically the ear spots are used to attract mates in males, this may also explain why it initially uses them on the hunter in the opening cutscene too. So for my thoughts on Kecha and Bishaten, I'm mixed. Because I think Kecha is an excellent monster that does everything right, but I also don't feel very much for it. The design is fairly good, but like a fair few in 4th gen, it can also feel like it suffers from trying to do too much at once, and not focusing too well on some of the different aspects. For the brachiating monkey aspect, I also think a gibbon-based monster would be pretty cool, but for Kecha they presumably wanted him as a fun trickster people would like, instead of a horrific Slenderman death ape. The fight is generally excellent, with some of the best environmental usage in 4U. There's a lot of personality there too with his intro, how he moves, but also his little tantrum move when enraged. He's a water monster, which we always need more of, especially in early game. But despite recognising all that, I don't love him, and I have little idea why. 4U has its roster bloat, but as an earlier monster, Kecha shouldn't have been hit too hard by that. Who knows? Though Ash is a pretty mid-subspecies too. Actually, that's a little harsh. It's sort of the Sand Barioth to base Kecha's Snow Barioth. You can see it's trying to do something different, and for the most part it succeeds, with the nice new animations. But the environmental factor was such a big part of the initial monster, it can't help but feel lesser in comparison. Also, how does Kecha see when he covers his eyes with his ears? When introduced, Kecha was a less powerful take on the try-introduced type of monsters in the series, of the 3D gliders. Monsters which, even if they have true flight, focus much more on a fast agile fight, with environmental usage and chiefly gliding acrobatics over flight if present. Barioth introduced this in Try. Toby would later fulfill this role in World, and it seems something they had in mind from the beginning with the vampire bears, who Kecha takes a lot of design cues from. Between Kecha and the other bears, I now doubt we'll ever see them in the series, which is a shame. It'll be interesting to see who the next glider is in Wilds though. I think this is a pretty solid trope that typically leads to fun and dynamic fights with great environment use. And I really think it could work well if the idea of the ancient forest was doubled down on even more, for a proper deep rainforest map over a more open jungle. Bishaten also partly fulfilled this role with Toby in Rise, and whilst I think Kecha is a good monster I don't feel much for, I think Bishaten is essentially a lesser version of Kecha. Despite everything, his fight isn't actually bad. It might be the best of the early game roster in Rise in fact, and one of the better ones in base Rise overall too. Bishaten's auto-spawning of fruits makes for an alright gimmick, but it's pretty disappointing he couldn't do something as simple as go to a fruiting tree to get them, what with Rise being fatally allergic to environmental interactions. And Blood Orange Bishaten is also a pretty mid-subspecies too. Some really dislike his design and think he should be a bird wyvern. I don't care enough either way. Though as one of the more natural looking Rise originals, he's one that wouldn't look too out of place in future games, and generally I think he could slot pretty easily into any forest or swamp map. Thanks for watching, and thanks as ever to my patrons, the Superus Duper, Samburgo, K Sandom, Holden, Nickname 3110, Eringar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu for their ongoing support of the channel. If you liked this video and would like to contribute, a link is provided in the description, and any amount is always appreciated. The next monster has already been voted in, but you'll be in time for future videos. Thanks to Kamen Rider Moten for their usually excellent digital artwork of the two as well. Their assorted social media is provided in the description, and they're now taking commissions too, if you want to get your own headcanons realised in a similar style, so be sure to check them out. Not much to say in the debrief, what with this being the first video back after wrapping up World War Z, other than go and watch World War Z if you haven't already. The videos, my videos I mean, not the film. Never the film. Likes and shares as ever are always appreciated now that Monster Hunter and general Big Lizard content resumes. The algorithm won't be smiling too much on my content right now, and these two definitely are the monsters to jumpstart that, but maybe the next one will be. Hopefully I'll see you there for it.